Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is John Warren. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Senate at UHN. You'll also hear this afternoon from Susan Freeman, who is the other co-chair of the Senate. We're thrilled you could join us, and I'm pleased to welcome the esteemed members of our Senate, the UHN Foundation Board of Directors, the UHN Impact Collective, and UHN supporters who are also with us this afternoon. If I could just speak for a second to the members of our Senate. As you know from participating in this event this afternoon, we are open to trying out new types of activities or events that might interest you. And I hope this one does. We invite your feedback on this event, and if you have suggestions of other events that you think might be interesting for our fellow members, please let us know. And you can contact Christy Spencer or Kimberly Trumper at the Foundation. A New Doc in Maple Ridge, the best-selling medical thriller written by Dr. Bell, the former CEO of UHN, was released in September of this year and has quickly garnered support and much attention in the medical community. For those of you who have had a chance to read the novel, you will find it, I'm sure you found it fast-paced, a brilliantly written page-turner, grounded in the unparalleled, extensive experience of Dr. Bell. Although the book may be fictional, it skillfully enlightens the reader on healthcare issues, including the importance of primary care and social medicine, and more on that later. Today, we'll have the chance to hear firsthand from the author how his experience as a surgeon, as a CEO of a major hospital, and a provincial deputy minister of health inspired the plot. Facilitating the conversation is former Ontario Minister of Health and UHN Foundation board member, Deb Matthews. We want you, our audience, to join in the conversation as well. At the end of the presentation, we'll be answering audience questions. Follow the Slido link at the bottom of the screen, and you will have an opportunity to submit and vote on the questions you would like to see answered. I'm pleased now to pass the virtual microphone over to Bob and Deb.
Bob, we're here to talk about A New Doc in Maple Ridge.
Yes, indeed.
I wonder if we could start by you telling us what this book is about.
Thanks, Deb, and thanks, John, for that kind introduction. Deb, this book it starts off by being a medical thriller, a medical drama, the story of Dr. Ed Brinkley, who is a battlefield surgeon who spent more than 10 years in Afghanistan. Very, very confidential work that he's done that's highly classified by the military. He's done some very innovative things in battlefield surgery. He's saved many lives, but he returns injured, as many people returning from Afghanistan unfortunately did, with trauma of various types, and he needs to start over. And he chooses Maple Ridge, Arkansas, because he thinks that trauma surgery, battlefield surgery is now a young man's game. He's been interested in primary care. He likes what's going on in Arkansas with primary care. He thinks it's a progressive way to provide care, and he wants to settle down and start a practice. He meets the lovely Linda Davis in the second chapter, and things are looking up for Ed because Linda's a remarkable woman in her own right, a lawyer who has one of the biggest class action law firms in America operating out of this small town in Arkansas. But unfortunately, as his practice develops, he runs afoul of a bad guy, Tony Malto. He refuses to accept the bullying that Tony applies to him to try and get him to do something very unethical, try to get him to treat his sexually transmitted disease and treat it in his wife without telling his wife, which is an interesting part of the novel that comes from my experience as a GP, and the experience that Ed has, Linda Davis have with Tony Malto and with various gangsters in Arkansas and in Biloxi is combined with flashbacks to Afghanistan, learning what Ed has done that's brought him to Arkansas with some PTSD concerns.
So I'm a bit worried that we need a spoiler alert. You're not going to
Fair
tell us
enough.
too much, are you?
I'm not indeed. So Ed has lots of challenges in this book. And Deb, as you know, we've had this chat. It is a drama, it is a thriller, but it's also got some messages as well. Things that speak to the importance of primary care in healthy communities, the importance of social medicine, what we have here in Canada that we should cherish, a publicly funded health system, and the precarious nature of healthcare that exists in the United States that you and I learned about when you were minister and I was deputy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, Bob, I think novelists hate this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I think any novel is part real life experience and part from your imagination. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the elements of the book that actually come from real life experience?
Yeah, well, you know, you're absolutely right. I think a good novel takes reality and stretches it just a bit. So it's believable, but still introduces drama that perhaps isn't there in day-to-day medical care. So certainly some of the scenes from the emergency department, from the obstetrics suite, were drawn from my experience as a primary care doc. You know, I started as a primary care doc before becoming a surgeon in Brampton, and that was a very enlightening 3 years of practice. So there are some experiences that I had long ago as a primary care doc, certainly not like the excellent primary care physicians at UHN today. Also, the battlefield scenes were drawn from reality. Some of that surgery is surgery that's actually done, that I've done in the operating room, not on the battlefield. So those experiences were real. And, you know, you remember that we traveled to Washington to sometimes give advice to the Americans about how their health system needed to evolve, sometimes to learn from them. And Arkansas was embarked on a primary care reform program that you and I heard about. And on my repeated trips there, I became impressed by what Arkansas was trying to do. So that was part of the reason why Arkansas became the focal point for the book. The other thing was, and I'll be careful of a spoiler alert, the unethical demand that's placed on our hero, Dr. Ed Brinkley, by the local gangster, Tony Malto, related to his sexually transmitted disease, is something. I didn't have the experience with sexually transmitted disease, but when I was in primary care practice, somebody asked me to do just that, to treat their wife for a condition that they got on a golfing trip, of all things. Mr. Warren will appreciate that, I'm sure. And, you know, I refused to do that, and this guy turned out to be a bit of a bad guy in Brampton, and there was some pressure. So that story, again, is stretched and extended, but stems from real experience.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So you talked a little bit about learning from the health system in Arkansas, the medical home model of care. Can you talk a little bit more about what that is?
Yeah, and this is something that Ontario has experience with. You know, the idea behind the patient medical home that intrigues Ed, that this is the reason why Ed goes to practice in Maple Ridge, is the concept that we treat people very well when they get into hospital, but we all know that's an expensive way to get people better. The idea with a patient medical home is to provide care in the community that will keep them out of the emergency department, out of the hospital. And much of that is not doctor care. You know, doctors are wonderful at diagnosing and setting a treatment plan in place. But, you know, the people who educate, the people who check on patients, who cajole them and convince them they should manage their blood sugar, they should keep their heart failure under control, are so often nurses. They do a much better job of that, following up on a regular basis, than doctors do in many instances. And that's the concept of the medical home, that complex patients will have a team of appropriate care providers, doctors heading the team, but also nurses who will check on the patient regularly. If it's a mental health concern, social workers, for diabetics, maybe a dietitian, for example. So a bespoke team that will actually serve the patient's needs with the goal of keeping them controlled in their chronic disease, teaching them about how they should manage it, keeping them out of hospital. That's certainly been the concept that's thrived in Ontario with patient-centered medical homes. And Arkansas actually looked to Ontario when they were introducing that in that state.
So would that be what our family health teams really are supposed to be?
Well,
And then I want to ask you, how are we doing? How are the family health teams doing? Are they working? Are they doing what we all hoped they would do?
well, I think in many cases the answer is yes, that family health teams are this concept of nurses, nurse practitioners, social workers gathered around primary care practitioners. If they're managed to focus on complex patients with chronic diseases, the answer is yes, absolutely. The same impact that can be achieved in Arkansas can be achieved in Ontario. Now, unfortunately, the way that they were introduced, in many cases, it was the smart people, the smart patients, who figured out, boy, I really want to get a family health team. I want all these resources. People who didn't necessarily have chronic diseases. So I think you remember the conversations when you were health minister about how do we realign what is an excellent idea, an excellent model, so it serves the people who really need it. Because it is an expensive model of primary care and best suited for people who have congestive heart failure, diabetes, et cetera.
You know, I can say things now that I couldn't say when I was minister. And one of the things that I was told by a different deputy when I was learning about our healthcare system was follow the money.
Yeah.
And if you follow the money, you will get the outcomes you incent.
Yeah.
And you have to be really careful what incentives you put into models. And if you want more complex patients, you have to incent that.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? I mean, complex patients are incented in the rostered models that provide compensation to primary care docs. So, you know, if you're a patient with complex problems, your primary care doc does get more to look after you. When it comes to this patient medical home model, however, the incentive actually was figured out by patients. You know, patients are smart as well as doctors. And people figured out, I'd love to find a doctor who's part of a family health team because I betcha there are more resources available for that doctor's patients than for others. So
Well,
that's been part of it.
Back to the book.
Back to the
Back to the book.
All right.
Bob, in the book, there are some real deep dives into a few things. You talked about the battlefield in Afghanistan. I tell you, take us way into that story of performing surgery on the battlefield. I could almost taste the blood. I mean, it was very detailed and very deep. You also took us very deep into the underworld, the criminal underworld. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the research you did, because as far as I know, you have not performed surgery on the battlefield in Afghanistan. And as far as I know, you've never been involved with the underworld, the criminal underworld. So I wonder if you could just talk about the research you did to get those so detailed and so intense.
So my experience has certainly been closer to battlefield surgery than it has been to money laundering and drug dealing that the underworld represents in the book, Deb. Thank you for mentioning that. I wanted to be very clear to the audience. So one of my colleagues when I was a fellow in Boston was the chief orthopedic surgeon of the U.S. Army. He was head of Walter Reed. So that's when my interest in the ethics of warfare began. Because, you know, soldiers are brothers in arms, right, on both sides. So the way that doctors in the military and the way that professional soldiers think about the ammunition they use, et cetera, is to accomplish something that will degrade the enemy's abilities, but not necessarily kill people if they can avoid it. You know, there is some ethics to warfare, and I hadn't understood that concept. Of course, in Afghanistan, it was a different issue. It was a terrorist army that the U.S. forces, the Canadian forces, had determined they were fighting against. Whether or not you believe that depends on your political leanings, but that was certainly the ethic of what was being done. And elimination of leaders by surgical strikes, getting rid of Taliban leaders, was certainly part of the U.S. and the Canadian effort, no question. And in the book, of course, the idea is that the forces that Dr. Ed Brinkley is supporting want to get as close as possible to their targets, the Taliban leaders, to eliminate collateral damage. I hate that term, but
It's a terrible term.
it is a terrible term, but it is the term that's used. Of course, they don't want to send a drone in to blow up the village. So Dr. Brinkley is charged with developing innovative methods of surgery that if somebody is injured, far from the ability of any helicopter to pick up the injured soldier, he can allow the soldier to get back to the landing zone where the helicopter can pick them up. And this is actually real.
I wanted to ask you, so that
Yes.
chapter describes something that could really have happened.
Well, first of all, I've done that surgery, not on
Yeah.
the battlefield, but the treatment of complex fractures by stabilizing them with pins that are linked together outside the skin.
Yeah.
External fixation, I've done that. That exists. It's a fairly recent but very effective method of surgery. And believe it or not, there are articles in the medical literature from the French Foreign Legion who fight in fairly desperate places in Africa. And again, if their soldiers are injured legs or arms and they need to evacuate, they can stabilize their injuries so that they're able to march away as opposed to being carried away on a stretcher by their colleagues, which is difficult if you're deep.
So what can you tell us about your knowledge about the criminal underworld? Where did you learn about that stuff?
Well, I did some very deep research on that by watching several episodes of Ozarks.
Okay.
It reminds me of a story. In fact, I think one of the viewers tonight is Deputy Minister currently of Education in Ontario, Nancy Naylor.
Ah,
And her husband, Terry Follis, of course, is a good friend who has given me a lot of advice, served as a mentor. He's the winner of 3 Stephen Leacock Awards.
fantastic author. Yes.
Fantastic author. Operation Angus is just out. It's a great read. But when I was starting to get into this as a hobby to provide funding where possible to UHN charities, I said to Terry, so tell me about research, Terry. How do you actually get to the places you need to research? How do you do the work that creates that realistic background? And Terry said to me, you've heard about Google and Wikipedia, he said. He said, remember, Bob, this is called fiction. You are not writing a medical journal article. You do not need to footnote it. So, I mean, the role of Biloxi in a couple of thrillers, there was actually, as readers of the book will learn, the Dixie Gang in the book that Dr. Ed Brinkley and his lover, the lawyer Linda Davis, run afoul of, actually was the Dixie Mafia.
Oh, so that was taken from.
That's the true story
Okay.
from FBI files, and again, it was bent a little
Fascinating.
bit, but they were centered on the Gulf Coast, and they apparently did rebound after Hurricane Katrina, when billions of dollars
Yes, you talked about that.
flowed into the Gulf Coast. The underworld benefited as well as construction companies, because there were lots of new people there. You can imagine.
So just to switch gears a bit, one of the things I found most interesting about the book was the sort of behind the scenes dynamics between physicians and other health professionals. So we got to actually see what doctors say to one another when they don't think we're looking. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that relationship between physicians.
Yeah. Well, like any profession, relationship is everything, right? The trust that occurs. And when a new doctor enters town, comes into a practice, obviously there's a bit of a spotlight. Who is this guy? Where is he from? And in the book, Dr. Ed Brinkley is a bit of a man of mystery.
Yes.
He's arrived in Little Rock, or in Maple Ridge. People are not quite sure about where he's been. He's unable to talk much about his military experience because it's all classified. And people are wondering, how did this guy get here? And he turns out to be quite a remarkable doctor. In the first chapter of the book.
Yes, you're going to do a reading on.
Lovely. Would you like me to do that now?
Sure.
Or
Why
would
don't
that
you
be...
Sure, you can go ahead and do that right now.
So I've got to show you the chapter or the cover of this book designed by Isabella Fassler. I think is one of the nicest things about the book. It's beautiful. And I love the representation that Isabella provided. And I'm just going to read you from the very start of the book. Is that all right there?
Yes.
So sitting just outside the ER exam room, Dr. Ed Brinkley could sense the emergency doctor's growing concern as he tried to treat the young boy's asthma. Ed felt his own mouth drying with apprehension as the child's breathing became more and more labored. How long has he had asthma? The doctor asked the child's mother. She shook her head in confusion. He's never had this before, Doc. He was out in the yard playing, and he came in wheezing and moaning. It's just getting worse and worse. Ed watched as the middle-aged physician coached the distressed boy to breathe in asthma medication through an inhaler mask. The kid looked about 5 years of age. He was fighting and kept pulling the mask off his face. He could barely speak, with hoarse wheezing choking him as he required more and more effort to breathe. I can't breathe. Get that thing off of me. His mother was trying to convince her son to use the mask. William, you've got to listen to the doctor and breathe in that medicine. That medicine's going to help you breathe. It was clear to Ed that this kid was in real trouble. The emergency doc was also realizing he needed help. He called to the nurses at the ER front desk. Get me respiratory therapy and anesthesia, stat. A nurse at the desk relayed the order, which was immediately broadcast over the hospital speaker. Anesthesia and RT to ER stat. The phone on the reception desk rang seconds later, and the message was passed back to the doctor. Anesthesia and RT are tied up in the ICU for at least 10 minutes. No one can come until the next case is done in the OR. Ed knew he should not get involved until he was officially registered on staff. But the situation was deteriorating rapidly, and he knew this boy did not have asthma. Leaving his seat, Ed gingerly entered the ER and quietly addressed the doctor. Do you mind if I take a look? I've had some experience with airway problems like this. He showed his visitor's pass to the nonplussed physician. I'm Dr. Ed Brinkley. I was just appointed to staff at the hospital, and I'm here to see Dr. Stanton. Then, observing the child's deteriorating condition, he lost all hesitancy as his training and experience took control. He turned to the nurse. We need an IV for this kid right now. Ed knew that asthma makes a wheezing noise when a child is trying to breathe out through narrow, constricted air passages. The noise this child was making was higher pitched and increased when he was breathing in. His condition sounded similar to asthma, but it's called stridor in the medical textbooks. That sound told Ed that something was wrong with this kid's airway. The term doctors use to name the large tubes like the trachea that move air through the throat to the lungs. He asked the nurse, who was now starting the intravenous in the child's arms, do we have an ear, nose, and throat doctor in the hospital? She shook her head. Nope, they're in the office. They're not here in the hospital. Ed called to the desk. Phone ENT in the office and tell him we have a kid with a likely foreign body obstruction. We need more help here. Call a code blue, get an intubation tray. Get a rigid bronch set ready. The team in the OR responded rapidly, gathering equipment and making calls. 2 nurses joined their colleague, already looking after the boy. But just as rapidly as the code blue call went out over the PA, the struggling child stopped fighting and then just stopped breathing. They were losing him. To see what Ed does, you got to read the book. But that answers, I think, the question of, what do you do, right? You're in a situation. Ed recognized that something the doctor was missing was affecting the child and potentially could kill him. What do you do in that situation? How do you avoid just busting into the ER and taking over? So Ed made a bit of a reputational impact. It was both good and bad because the doctors weren't sure about him even more after that episode in the ER.
So what are doctors taught to do in that situation?
Wow. Well, professional courtesy and respect for colleagues is essential. And sometimes, most of the time, let's face it, if I know something that a colleague doesn't know and I suggest, chances are the doctor's going to listen to me. In this case, Ed wasn't sure. And in this case, he just simply had to find out himself. And as you know from reading the book, Deb,
Don't spoil it. Don't spoil.
I won't spoil it. I won't tell you what happened.
Don't spoil. But I tell you, even you reading that, I've read that a few times. I'm still nervous, even though I know how it ends. Anyway,
there you go.
Anyway, it's I think you raise a number of really interesting issues throughout the book. There's some threads you don't even realize it when you're reading, that that you're actually teaching us a few things. You talk about the racial segregation on the staff in the hospital. The black people are mostly less highly paid than the white people. You talk about it when the flooding, you raise climate change, even though you also talk about fracking. But anyway, we won't go there right now. But the flooding impacts the poorest people, the black people, the most when the river floods. And the 100-year river storms, other 100-year floods are now happening every 5 years. So you have a number of things that you've observed about the world that you just very nicely take us through.
Well, thank you. And one of my favorite characters in the book, not my favorite, but one of my favorite is Esther Hightower.
Me too.
You liked Esther?
Loved her.
I loved her too, because I've met Esther in many different places in the healthcare system. Esther, for those of you who haven't read the book, is the person that runs the family practice unit where Dr. Ed Brinkley goes to work. And, as Esther realizes, and Esther implies, she's there forever. This is her clinic. She's been there for 20 years. She came to the clinic as an aide. She's worked her way up to become a nurse, and she now runs it. And she knows the doctors are there. Many of them will come and go. They're there to build their practice. But Esther knows the people of Maple Ridge, and Esther's there to make sure that the right people get the right care. And sometimes she has to lead her doctors gently, and sometimes she has to tell them what they need to do. I loved Esther. She's a tall and proud woman, and she runs a tight ship.
She knows what's going on.
She does indeed. She knows what's happening.
Now, I have to ask you a question that I think a lot of people are curious about. You've done some of your education in the States, but by and large, the vast majority of your life has been spent in Canada. So talk to us about why, you've touched on it before. What does it mean to be here in Toronto but write a book based in Arkansas?
Well, to be absolutely straightforward, one of the goals of this is to make some money for the UHN Foundation. And my hope is, and we're trying to work on this, getting it into the American market is something that can be helpful. The next book is set in Toronto. That's going to be really fun. It is really fun. But, we observed the United States. We learned from the United States. We learned both what to do in healthcare, the wonderful advances, the innovation that's derived from the American healthcare system, but we also see the incredible inequity. And we see the vulnerability that the healthcare system induces. For example, Arkansas is a right-to-work state. And with your background and social issues, you know what that means. That means a lot of part-time work. It means a lot of workers who don't have benefits, who don't have health insurance. And those people are so vulnerable because they have to pay cash for their health care.
And if they don't have the cash?
Well, Obamacare has been a big step forward, no question. And we've all done research on that and read about that. But the insurance companies that run the Obamacare exchanges realized soon after the exchanges started for Obamacare that poorer people were more expensive than they thought they might be, and they kept on raising the rates for people, and they changed the policies. So Obamacare has been good, but it certainly hasn't solved all the problems. The other thing associated with healthcare in the States is, of course, if you're getting good healthcare through good insurance provided by your workplace insurance, God forbid that you should lose your job.
Right.
And the vulnerability that Ed talks about as he's returning, Ed has an interesting perspective because he left the United States shortly after the terrible event at the Twin Towers. He left to go to the Middle East where he became a trauma surgeon. He's now returning. He's now returning more than 10 years later, and he's seeing that, that sense that America had at the end of the Cold War when democracy had prevailed and America was at the top of the world, was now being considered in a different way. And the vulnerability that results from so much inequity, the diversity that results in some people having 99% of the wealth with 1% of the people, those sorts of issues have increased over the time that Ed's been away. The vulnerability and the precarious nature. And he talks in the book about diseases of desperation for people who've been left behind, right? For middle-aged men especially who used to have factory jobs. Those factory jobs have either been replaced by automation or have moved offshore. And they now can't support the families the way that their parents did, their fathers did. And those men resorting to various drugs, OxyContin, we know that story, fentanyl, we know those stories, those diseases of desperation, treating anxiety with opioids are something that Ed observes in his new practice and is disturbed by, comments on.
You also really put a focus on domestic violence. And two of the main characters are involved in serious domestic violence.
Yep.
And so there are many issues you shine a light on. So.
Well, I think Ed finds that issue of the change in the American economy that's left so many people behind can result in spousal abuse and domestic violence. And certainly the thing that I don't know much about except by watching Ozarks, that criminal side that gets highlighted here through the Dixie Gang members. Certainly Sharon Malto, who's the wife of Tony Malto, the local gangster, is in a desperate situation. And that is part of what Ed feels the obligation to resolve as her family doctor.
Yes, he does.
He stands up for her.
I've heard writers say that one of the best things about being an author is that you get to create characters you really like. And then you get to hang out with those characters and they get to do things that are fun. Do you have a favorite character that you liked hanging out with as you were writing this book?
Well, the person that was hard for me to write, first of all, because I'm a guy and she's a woman, is Linda Davis. And I have to give credit here to Simon Madwar, who's the editor of this book, who frequently tells me, Bob, you don't know how to write about women, and has helped me tremendously in getting Linda to the point that she's at in this book. But I love Linda Davis. I mean, Linda is feisty. She's a class action lawyer whose family goes back multiple generations in Maple Ridge. They've been there since the Civil War. She joined her father in law practice, and he had an unfortunate accident when she was just 2 or 3 years into her practice, and she had to take over the firm. And she stuck it out. She changed her kind of frivolous lifestyle to become a real hard-working lawyer. And then she found this incredible thing. She ended up with a class action lawsuit for poor black women in Arkansas who were working all kinds of overtime for a big retailer. You can put those two together. I know Mr. Warren's already made that connection. But she makes the class action lawsuit work for those women. And suddenly she discovers that here in this small town of Maple Ridge, when you're finding little people as clients, you don't need to have the big corporate offices. You don't need to be in Washington, New York, Chicago. You can be in a small town. And you need to have people with a small town attitude where they need to find people who've been harmed and they need to go out and help them. And that's the kind of atmosphere that's the kind of ethos that Linda brings to her law firm. And of course, she also thinks that what she's discovering through Ed about the gangsters operating in her town is not something that she's going to put up with. So she decides she's going to help Ed.
She's pretty cool.
She is pretty cool. I love
She's pretty
Linda.
cool. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Linda's also bringing a class action lawsuit against an orthopedic spine company
Yes.
that has got some very, very risky devices in place. And, you know, that's another thing that's very close to reality. It's a little bit stretched, a little bit exaggerated, but it's pretty close to reality.
So, Bob, how are sales going?
Sales are going well. I mean, I was astonished that we suddenly, with the support of the people, the wonderful people at UHN and friends and people on Med Twitter, you know, I was shocked. This turned to be the #1 bestseller in the medical drama, the medical fiction category. There are lots of categories on online sales of books, but it is in that category. It's been #1. And, you know, the one thing I wanted to do, Deb, I don't know if you'd mind this, but based on the early sales, just the first really, it's only been out for a month, and royalties have only been announced for the first couple of weeks. But I'd like to present you as a foundation board member, if you wouldn't mind,
Well, thank
with
you
this
very,
check that
very
represents
much.
sales in the first few weeks.
So, for people at home, this is a very generous check.
Well,
This is a $10,000 check.
Wow.
So I want to say thank you very, very much, Bob. That's extremely generous. And you know, well, maybe you could talk a little bit about where this money is going.
well, yeah. So this is going to support a cause that's become near and dear to my heart, especially through COVID. A primary care research chair at the Toronto Western Hospital, where an investigator who's a primary care doctor is going to be hired to look at the social impact of the environment on primary health care. So looking at some of the areas the Toronto Western serves, which are less fortunate areas, marginalized neighborhoods, to look and see how primary care services can actually reach out and provide better care to those communities for things like COVID inoculations,
Yeah.
immunizations, but also for dealing with some of those chronic diseases that, you know, are present in the book here. Breast cancer screening is a great example. Elevated blood pressure, you know, a lot of people in those neighborhoods don't see primary care doctors. How do we serve those people better so that they know if they have to watch their blood pressure, they know if they've got early diabetes? That's what this chair is designed to do, and that's what these contributions to our wonderful UHN Foundation are designed to assist.
Well, that's terrific.
And
Thank you
you've
so
taken
much.
on the role as the champion of social medicine
I
in
have.
the foundation. I was so
I have.
pleased because that fits your background so perfectly.
It really does. It
Yeah.
really, really does. And most people don't really know what social medicine is. So really it's about expanding healthcare to some of the causes of hospitalization or causes of illness. And I think we in healthcare are very good at looking after disease or problems, but a lot of what people see in the hospitals can be avoided if people had a safe place to live, if they had an adequate diet.
Wow.
So social medicine, I'm working with Dr. Andrew Boozery, who lives and breathes this kind of thing.
Know him well.
So I'm really hoping that we're going to have an impact on looking at those who are homeless, those who are facing the greatest barriers to wellness, and doing a much better job making sure that people get the benefits outside the hospital so they don't have to come into the hospital.
You know, I'm so impressed with what Kevin Smith has done at UHN, stretching the intellectual curiosity. Obviously, UHN, fourth best hospital in the world, Toronto General Hospital, has got a huge focus on biomedical science, what genes cause disease, developing better treatments. But Kevin has rightly pointed out where you live and if you live in a safe place is one of the most important things to determine your health. And good on Kevin for bringing that into the UHN realm of investigation and implementation of new projects.
Yeah.
Great thing.
It's
And thanks
stretching
to
the
you.
scope, but it's very exciting to be part of it.
Yes, indeed. No, it's an important new part of what UHN is leading, and especially with COVID, where we've seen how this terrible disease has impacted marginalized communities. I think this focus, and housing, when you've got, 8 people in a small apartment, how you're at such risk from this
How are
pandemic.
you going to isolate?
How you
Yeah.
can isolate. I think
Yeah.
we've learned the importance of this.
And I volunteered at some of the clinics, the vaccination clinics.
Good for you.
It was terrific. So these were clinics set up in neighborhoods where
Yeah.
vaccination rates were low. And it was a real education for me to see how if you go there, people will come.
Yeah.
And so we were able to bring, I say we, they, I was there, what the heck?
You were there. It was we.
We're able to dramatically increase the vaccination rates in those neighborhoods where actually vaccinators went out to the community.
Yeah.
And who knows how many lives that saved?
Well, part of UHN Open Labs has also looked at where seniors live and has identified the fact that an awful lot of seniors live in vertical aging communities,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
And bringing
That aren't
back-
called seniors' homes.
Absolutely, they're independent apartment
Yeah.
buildings, but seniors live
Lots
there.
of seniors.
A lot of them come from communities that don't access health care. And the NORC ambassador, the high-rise ambassador movement of discovering, that building has a lot of Urdu people. We better find some Urdu ambassadors
Exactly.
who can, and that sounds like the project you were involved with. Mm-hmm. Very, very cool.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah, nice to see UHN leading that.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Great organization, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
You did a nice job there, Bob.
Oh my goodness. Let me tell you, there have been a lot of great leaders at UHN.
Yes, indeed. I wonder now if we can move to some questions from the audience. Are you ready, Susan, to ask some questions of Bob?
I am, Deb. First of all, I want to thank both you and Bob. You did a great job today. That was a great discussion. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh,
we
we
just
can't
lost
hear you
you.
now.
So, do you think I should read the question? Michael, are we going to get Susan back on, or?
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're on.
Okay. All right. First question. What's more difficult to execute, writing a novel or surgery?
Oh my goodness. Well, definitely. You've got a lot more. I've had a lot more training to do surgery than to write a novel. This is a wonderful hobby. I've had great coaches. I've had people who've given me terrific advice. I think probably 2 novels from now, I may understand how to do it a bit better. But it's, as Deb said, you develop these wonderful characters that live with you for a couple of years. The third novel I'm working on relates to a lawyer in Toronto who comes from the James Bay community. And the other character is a young woman orthopedic surgeon who's so distressed by the misogyny in surgery.
Oh,
So these 2 characters interact in a variety of ways, and I'm loving both of them. They're both great people to live with. So, answer to your question, we get a lot more detail. You'll be happy to hear that we get a lot more training for surgery than you get to be a novelist. And I wouldn't call myself a novelist yet, not by any means.
Okay, well, you've answered one of the other questions because the question was, this is your second novel and that we hear a third is on the way. What inspires you to write fiction? And can we ever expect a memoir or a nonfiction in the future?
Well, yeah, so, in terms of real writing, I mean, people at UHN are expected to publish their experience, right? And I was fortunate over my career to have published, 250 papers during the time that I was practicing surgery. So describing what happened in surgery, looking after patients with bone cancer, which is what I did when I was a surgeon, that's something I've had a lot of experience with. Right now, I'm just thoroughly enjoying the imagination of creating characters and weaving them through plots that are believable, but stretched enough to be really interesting, and stretched enough that the drama's there, and that you keep on turning the pages to find out what happens to these people. That's the fun part.
Well, I think you've had an interesting enough life that someday somebody might write your biography.
I don't think so.
Maybe.
That's sweet of you to say, Susan, but I don't think so.
Okay, now, interesting plot line regarding Afghanistan. Why was it important to have this character arc about trauma doc?
Yeah. So, you know, I think for a physician to introduce readers to what happens in medical settings, I think people have a great interest in medical settings. They want to know what goes on in the ER. They want to know what goes on in the operating room. In this book, there's a scene from a delivery suite, from an obstetrical delivery that is pretty tense. I think people like that insider look, and I've been fortunate. You know, I worked for 3 years as a GP before working as a trauma surgeon, orthopedic surgeon, a cancer surgeon. So I've had a variety of healthcare experiences, and I think people like to come close to that. Now, in terms of Ed's experience in Afghanistan, you know, I think we've all been intrigued by what happened there, the way the war was conducted, a tragedy, obviously, that's played out so dramatically after the book was finalized and published. Along comes the fall of Kabul. So Afghanistan served as a place for Ed to get deeply engaged in surgical innovation, to get the experiences that troubled him so deeply that he comes back from that experience with very severe post-traumatic stress and needs to conquer that prior to starting again. Afghanistan was just the obvious place, and Afghanistan rather than Iraq, because I think all Canadians feel closer to Afghanistan, because certainly our soldiers' experience in Kandahar was in our lives daily and just felt close to me.
There are inter-hospital hierarchical issues raised in the book. Did you see this play out in real life as CEO at
No.
And
Susan.
how can we work to solve those issues?
Well, fortunately, Susan, as you well know from your understanding of the wonderful doctors who work in UHN, they are all so collaborative and get along so well together that there's never any conflict amongst the medical staff members, no more than there would have been conflict between the lawyers at Mr. Warren's firm, right, John? So, you know, obviously, the high-performing folks at UHN, a bunch of thoroughbreds. Occasionally, they need to be steered, right? But somebody like Kevin Smith has figured out how to do that. Brian Hodges, the wonderful medical leadership, Shafka Shavji, Catherine Tink, you know, the wonderful leaders that are there. These are the people that are looked up to by medical staff, who look to those leaders when they're feeling hot and bothered and take their leadership in their stride. So it's a good place to work because of the collaboration, and it's a great place to work because of the extraordinary quality of the people who are there.
Well said. Apart from funding issues, what do you think is the biggest obstacle to delivering first-class primary care to Ontarians?
Oh, isn't that a great question? You know, I think we're in the midst of a bit of a cataclysm in primary care. Again, something the pandemic has taught us. You know, it's this issue of virtual care versus in-person care. It's the issue of how many primary care doctors are going to be in these advantaged rostered models that did reasonably well. They didn't have to be seeing patients. Most of them saw patients, but there are certain primary care docs in Ontario that are advantaged. And of course, the way this works is a labor management table. That's where it happens, discussions between the government and the OMA. Fortunately, the people leading this from the government's perspective and the people from the OMA want the best from patients, for patients. They don't have the same view. But just this issue of virtual care is going to be a big issue for primary care. Let's face it, many, many problems can be seen, but some problems have to be seen in person, and that's a problem that needs to be worked out.
Can I just add a thought to this? I think the future, I hope, involves a whole lot more collaboration between people with different skills.
Yeah.
So that especially I'm thinking of elderly people who want to stay at home as long as they can, They need to have a doctor who will make house calls, but they also need to have another coordinated group of people who are there to support them on a day-to-day basis. And I just think we can do a whole lot better in keeping people out of long-term care, a whole lot better, if we were to provide a more integrated approach to people as they age and get to that stage where the alternative might just be long-term care, which is far more expensive to the system and not the highest quality of life for people who would much rather stay in their home.
You know, I have to pay tribute to, I'm going to call her for a moment, Minister Matthews, for two things. She realized a long time ago the future of seniors' care is home care. And she also realized that if we're going to have a home care system or if we're going to have long-term care, that the people at the bottom of the healthcare pyramid, the personal support workers, need to have a career, not simply be put into situations for minimum wage. And Deb, when she was minister, increased the salary of personal support workers by $4.50 an hour.
Yes.
Over 3 years. I was lucky to be able to implement some of that. That was a big step forward. That sense of valuing people who are quote unquote at the bottom of the pyramid is something that's crucial because, as you say, nobody wants to go into long-term care. Nobody wants their parents, their grandma, their aunt or uncle to go into long-term care. The goal is to be independent, and for that, the future is home care.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, that concludes our audience questions for today. Thank you, Deb and Bob, for such an enjoyable and informative session. And thank you for everyone in the audience for joining us. Go out and buy the book.
Buy the book. Every penny comes back to the foundation. Please
Yes.
buy the book. You'll enjoy it, and it's a
Great book.
good cause.
Every penny
Every
goes
penny,
back,
every
which
penny
is
comes back.
enormously generous.
Yes, indeed. Thanks, everybody, for being here today. And thank you, Deb.
Thank you, Bob.
Great to see you, Minister.
Great to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.